You know, I've had some weird stuff over the years. I suppose from an outside perspective, most of what I do on here seems kind of weird or very weird. You know, through the eyes of an outsider who's not in this, whatever community this is, arms and armor enjoyers, among other things. But I figured it would be kind of fun to do like a top 10 of the strangest things that I've had. I'm not going in the order of weirdness, but simply in chronological order. So, starting all the way back in 2013, 12 years ago, I had the Pedersoli Derringer Guardian. Compared to some of the other things on this list that we'll get to, it's not that weird, but I still have to wonder, who is this for? Well, back then it was a so-called parlor pistol for Victorian gentlemen who would like to do some social plinking indoors. But who is it for nowadays? Mainly people who like novelties and historical stuff, I suppose. What is it? So it's a Derringer style, very compact pistol that uses just a percussion cap as a propellant for 4.5 millimeter BBs or pellets, muzzle loaded. The name Guardian suggests that it might be intended for self-defense. I mean, think about it, 4.5 millimeter BB or pellet, propelled by nothing but a number 209 primer. It's anemic, and it's a single shot, and it's a muzzle loader, and just because anyone can have it doesn't mean it's a good idea for self-defense or home defense. Honestly, I think the name's just misleading. When I look at Pedersoli's website, it mentions that some models of Derringer were made in this caliber and used for pickling and indoor shooting. I don't even know what pickling is. I mean, when I look it up, you get the other kind of pickling. Recreational target shooting, that's really the only thing that makes sense here. And even then, it's not amazing for that either. It's kind of a neat plinker, but you're probably better off with a CO2 pistol. So the next one is something I designed and so creatively called the Skallcleaver back in 2014, I believe. My idea was to create a do-it-all bushcraft / self-defense knife hatchet thingamajig, and it was too ambitious. I crammed way too many functions into it, and as so often happens when you try to combine too many things, then the resulting hybrid is bad at any of those functions. So I had the hatchet part, axe part, whatever, which also functioned as a knuckle guard. And at the end of that was a thick chisel sort of deal. And then at the knife end, it was only sharpened in the top third or so, but more than a third. And the rest of it was a blunt ricasso, if you will, which was intended to be held so that you can reverse it and use it as a really bad axe, you know, because at that point you've choked up so far that you have very little leverage. You could chop with it, but not amazingly. Yeah, and the handguard axe thing also was supposed to double as an ulu knife. You can remove the handle scales, or in the second version, it didn't have handle scales, it was just wrapped in paracord, so that you can also mount it to a stick, so you have like an improvised halberd, basically. Yeah, I went for so many different things. It looked pretty cool, and I fixed some of the problems that the prototype had in the second version, but still, it was trying too many things. Oh yeah, you can throw it too. Yeah, you can do a lot with it, but none of it exceptionally well. I feel like the throwing part is probably the best. Then in 2015, I got an antique mambele from Africa, which is also called sickle sword. That one was quite interesting, definitely sort of design that you don't see in this form anywhere in Europe, really. It was also interesting not just because of the shape, but the material as well. It was made of iron. While most things we get our hands on in terms of reproductions now are, of course, made of steel. It has a tendency to bend much more easily and doesn't retain an edge as much. But really cool design. Not just the balance, also the curvature in and of itself. It makes it handle very differently. It's almost axe-like because you have that much extra mass at the end. And yeah, you can either use the blade to like a sword basically, or you can use the tip as a war pick basically. So really neat design. Was definitely interesting to experiment with. It would be kind of cool to at some point have something like that made in an improved version. Well, what I consider improved. I would like some kind of hand protection on that as well, even though it didn't matter when used with a shield. But it would be nice to mess around with that kind of thing. Then in 2017, the custom Armorslayer happened, based on the Armorslayer from Fire Emblem Awakening. I was looking at that design and thinking that would be really interesting to try out to see how practical it is, particularly with this sort of fishtail top of the blade. And I made some changes because I was looking at that upswept pommel and thinking that no, we're not doing that. In my design, I curved it in the opposite direction so it doesn't interfere with the forearm, which makes a lot more practical sense. The final result was functional, very heavy for the size. Of course, it depends on a number of things, like how thick you make it. The blade was fairly thin, really, but it's still quite wide. And the guard had some thick steel plates that also added to the weight. Now, a lot of the weight was in the back, which is good because otherwise it would have been extremely top heavy. So that brought the balance back a little bit. Still so clunky that it wasn't exactly what I'd call an agile weapon by any means. Definitely fun to try out and devastating. As slow as it is, it hits quite hard for sure. So that was a really cool experiment. This is the kind of stuff that I would have loved to do more often, but it's expensive. Like custom work like that doesn't go cheap, of course. Also in 2017, I got an antique axe from either the Tsonga or the Venda people, both belonging to the Bantu group in southern Africa. And that one is weird to us as Westerners. For them, of course, it's perfectly normal, but it just stood out to me by its construction. It's a completely different take on an axe compared to what we would expect. So this was essentially, if you think about a long spear point or maybe like a short sword, except that the tang isn't at the bottom but at a right angle, and then the tang is what goes into this bulbous end of the handle. So completely different way of doing it. And that is very interesting because now you have an axe that's remarkably good at thrusting as well. I don't know if they used it that way, but it could be used as such. And also an extremely long blade. The way I would describe it is if you took a hewing spear with a long blade and an axe and fused them together, this is what would happen. Very fascinating design. One of those things that if I saw it in a video game, I'd be like, wow, that's a weird design, but it's from real life. Apparently 2017 was the year of oddities because it was also when I designed the modular version of a Roman Scissor / Indian pata. That thing was wild. It took the fully enclosed arm guard from the Roman gladiator weapon, and there were several different attachment pieces that would screw into the top of it. One being the classic crescent-shaped blade that you would see on an original depictions of a Scissor. I'm not aware of a single one that actually survived. Another one that was pointier and different spikes that go on top of it. That thing was a very impressive feat of craftsmanship to make this all modular in a very solid way. It wasn't flimsy by any means, and it lined up perfectly. By far the coolest, most unique thing I've ever had. I still kind of regret having sold it, even though, at the time I thought, okay, I'm basically done with it and I need to free up the funds for the next thing, and I didn't want to accumulate too much stuff, so I probably would have gotten rid of it sooner or later anyway, but still kind of a shame. But I hope it's found a good new home. Actually, it may not be the most unique one, because the year after that, 2018, I designed something based on a Tonfa and a sickle or scythe or whatever you want to call it. Honestly, kind of ugly, but it was something that I wanted to experiment with, and it worked quite well, especially the sickle part, which acted like a war scythe, except that it's strapped to your forearm, which makes it really worse, arguably. And also, it kind of needed something on top, which originally I did include in the design, some sort of hand guard. It was like a knuckle guard in front of it, but that didn't happen. Just complicated things a little too much. Yeah, this thing, again, kind of ugly, the way I designed it, but it was hard to argue with the sheer brutal effectiveness, and it didn't have one of the drawbacks of the previous design, which was whenever you tried to actually slash with it or use the point and the chopping motion, the Scissor thing would absolutely beat up your forearm brutally by slamming the hard edge of it like straight into it. This one didn't do that. So that was, I think that's what inspired me to do that originally. So you had this pretty large surface here that would rest against the arm, and it was oriented in a different way. So you could absolutely lay into it and deliver really powerful strikes with that sickle end without messing up your arm. So that was an improvement, but it's definitely not an improvement in terms of aesthetics. And because I like blades like that, in 2019 I commissioned the Reaper Scythe, which I have since turned into a War Scythe, but the idea with that was to have something that looks exactly like, well, a Reaper Scythe, and the kind of thing that you sometimes see in fantasy, where it's a more conventional scythe, at least conventional in the way it's mounted. It has that same angle, and I wanted to see how effective that is. So it is, again, like a war pick, so brutally effective in that regard. The only problem was that blade was really thin. It was actually too thin to be able to handle that. Essentially less versatile than a war scythe because you can't thrust with it, and it's really hard to cut with it too due to the angle. But using the point, yikes. And it looked cool too. It doesn't look quite as good anymore because as I turned it into something else, and my craftsmanship skills were not on that level. So it works better, it looks worse, which I suppose in a fantasy scenario that's a downgrade because looks are the most important part, as we all know. 2021, this was designed not by me, but a viewer who participated in a weapon design contest, and this is the design that won. So it's a long-hafted Khopesh of sorts based on Sly Cooper's hook staff. It had a mace head on the other end. This one surprised me with how much it excelled at cutting tatami mats in particular. So I was thinking the balance on this is not great for fighting because the mace head brought it back so far that the blade felt extremely light. There wasn't a whole lot of blade presence. I figured against harder targets that wouldn't have done very well. But tatami mats with a relatively thin and very sharp blade, zip, it was crazy how clean the cuts were. The year after that, 2022, there was the modified bat'leth. So I had a bat'leth made at first that was fairly close to the original design, and then I made some changes to try to improve it because I figured it doesn't actually need to be symmetrical. You can make one end longer, and also you can, instead of having 3 separate hand cutouts, you can just make it one continuous single cutout so that you're able to switch hand position more easily. So instead of having to get it out and reposition it, you can just slide the hand, and it works much better in that way. It looked way worse. I'll freely admit that. It does not look as good as the original, but I would argue that it worked a little bit better also because it helped save weight. The original was quite heavy, and yeah, overall, again, uglier but more functional. That seems to be a little bit of a running theme here that applied to a few different things. And those are the 10, but I also want to mention a few as not really honorable mentions, eccentric mentions, like the multi-blade flail thingamajig that I tried out in 2018. It was based on finger blades that I saw that were by themselves completely useless, so I decided to turn them into something also pretty useless, but fun, which was this thing. It didn't work very well. Those blades tended to fold in like a fan when hitting something, so that was not effective. What was way more effective, though, was taking 2 small throwing axes and bolting them together. That did something. I mean, worse than having them at the end of a rigid handle, because this way you have very little control over the alignment, so you can just end up slapping the target with the flat side of the blade instead of the edge. But it was more effective than I expected, actually. And then, of course, the entire Weirdest Knife series. There have been a bunch of strange ones, transforming knives, and weirdly shaped ones, and mostly unusual opening mechanisms, and also the ugliest folding knife I've ever seen. I still haven't spotted anything quite this hideous since. It really does look like an alien bug. Anyway, I thought it would be fun to look back and compile these. Yeah, let me know what you think. Maybe there's something else that you remember on my channel that you think would also fit into this list of the weirdest stuff. What's your favorite out of these? Let me know. And thanks for watching. Take care.